Good evening. Welcome to the virtual book launch for Daybreak Woman, An Anglo Dakota Life by Jane Lamb Carroll and published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. I'm Sharon Doherty, Professor of Women's Studies at St. Catherine University and Director of the Abigail Quigley McCarthy Center for Women at St. Kate's, co-host of tonight's event. We are happy to be collaborating with the press for this launch. The program will be 1 hour. The first 40 minutes will be dedicated to a conversation hosted by Professor Cecilia Conchar-Farr with Jane Shishoka Dutta and Tamara St. John, followed by a Q&A. Viewers are encouraged to pose questions and comments in the chat. Let me begin with introductions of tonight's speakers. Jane Carroll is Professor of History and Women's Studies at St. Catherine University, where she teaches courses in U.S. history, women's history, Minnesota history, and the history of European colonization. For the last 20 years, Jane's research has focused on the relationships, marriages, and families established by Dakota women and Anglo-American men in early 19th century Minnesota as a result of Euro-American colonization. As a historian of women, Jane keeps women central to these stories and this history. She assumes women were important and influential historical actors, even though many men of their times, as well as most historians, at least until recent decades, have ignored their presence or dismissed their contributions as insignificant. By focusing on people of mixed European and Dakota ancestry and the experiences of all the Dakota people, Jane aims to restore Indigenous people to the historiography of Minnesota, in which they remain grossly underrepresented. Our next speaker, Cecilia Conchar-Farr, is Professor of English and Women's Studies and a Carondelet Scholar in the Women's College at St. Catherine University, where she teaches, researches, and writes about popular literature and the history of the novel. Cecilia is author of the Ulysses Delusion, Rethinking Standards of Literary Merit, and Reading Oprah, How Oprah's Book Club Changed the Way America Reads. And she's editor of several essay collections, including the soon-to-be-published Open at the Close, literary essays on the Harry Potter novels. Cecilia and Jane have been in the same writing group for too long to admit. Next, Tamara St. John is an enrolled member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Sioux Tribe of the Lake Traverse Reservation of South Dakota. She works with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office on cultural preservation issues and is the tribal archivist and curator of collections. Tamara is a Native American genealogist and has done extensive research in the history of the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, or Ochete Shakowin. And I'm going to stop right there, and our fourth speaker is going to help me with language. Shishoka Dutta, would you pronounce the last thing I just said?
Ochete Shakowin.
Okay, thank you. Tamara has worked with the Minnesota Historical Society and along with other Dakota tribes collaborated on the Commemorating Controversy, the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 exhibition. She has worked with the North Dakota State University Center for Heritage Renewal on the history of the Dakota War and the massacre of Whitestone Hill. Tamara is a current board member of the South Dakota Humanities Council and in 2018 was elected to the South Dakota State Legislature serving District 1 in the House of Representatives. She was re-elected to another 2-year term this year. Tamara lives in Sisseton, and could we get a better pronunciation than mine for that?
Sisseton.
Sisseton, South Dakota, and works at the Sisseton-Wahpeton Tribal Archives and Collections located at Agency Village. And our final speaker to be introduced, Shishoka Dutta is a Dakota from the Lake Traverse Reservation. He was born in Sisseton, South Dakota. He lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, and works at the University of Minnesota. Shishoka Dutta loves teaching the Dakota language. He is a lifelong learner and advocate for the Dakota language. It is also very important to this discussion that both Tamara and Shishoka Dutta are descendants of Daybreak Woman. And so now Shishoka Dutta will begin with a greeting in Dakota.
How Midako Yepe. Dayatu Kinde. Owasana chante washtea nape chiuzapido. Yushkian wachiangapi. Shishogaduta miedo. Tayetukin de hekta wichuichache otaheha wodakuewa apo hiaewe chiapi. In waharakapte. Nako tayetukin de Dakota Wia. Nako washichu wichashta kin. Hena wakan kijuzapi tiwahe gakapi kin. Hena iwaharakapte. Wohadakapi kinde. Daya yahipi. Wopira tanka chichapi.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm so honored to be here this evening. Not only do I love stories and study them for a living, but I've been involved with this story for quite a while in that writing group that Jane and I have been a part of for years. Oh, thanks, Sharon. And so I'm just really thrilled and honored to have the opportunity to guide this conversation a little bit tonight. And what I'd like to do, first I'd like to show you the beautiful book that we're talking about in case you haven't seen it. Daybreak Woman and Anglo Dakota Life by Jane Carroll. And we're really excited that the inside is just about as beautiful as the outside, with some lovely graphics and beautiful typeface. And yeah, it's just a terrific looking book. So that's fun too. What I'd like to do is start out by locating all three of you with respect to Daybreak Woman. So I'd like to know when you first learned about her. And maybe we can start with Shoshone, and then Tamara, and then Jane. And how did you all three eventually connect around her?
Sure. You know, I first learned about Daybreak Woman in my Dakota culture and history class. It was a prominent historical figure. And at the time, I didn't know that was my relative, that I was descended from her. And it wasn't until I was talking to my cousin Tamara that I found out that she was part of our family tree. And I didn't really think too much about it at the time after I found that out until about, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember exactly when. Jane enrolled in my class, Dakota Culture and History. And she told me that she was doing research on Daybreak Woman. And that's why she wanted to take Dakota Culture and History class, to kind of get a little more context for the culture of the people for her book. And so then we had some chats about it, and it was very illuminating to me that this amazing woman and all the things she did in her life, and it made me feel really good to know that in my past that I have had these amazing ancestors. And so it kind of gives me a little bit of pride today to think about Daybreak Woman. So that's kind of how I learned about it.
Nice, thank you. Tamara?
Yes. For me, it began as a genealogist, and I had moved back to, I was born and raised on the Lake Travis Reservation in Sisseton-Wahpeton. And I came back to take care of my grandfather. And in spending time with my grandfather and my grandmother, I began to learn their family history, their stories. And my grandfather began to tell me about the Robertson family. And I had started to research and try to share with him some of the things that we live in a digital age that's all available online. And I began to trace the family tree back. And he began to tell me about his great-grandfather. He couldn't remember the first name. And this is how genealogy goes. It took months and months, agonizing months, to figure out who exactly his grandfather was. And at one point he said, My great grandfather was an interpreter, and he went to Washington D.C. as a boy. And with that information, I was able to determine that he was Thomas A. Robertson. And from there, began to study the whole family. And I had connected with some older women here on the reservation. And often I say that we have the most amazing genealogists that I've ever known in my life are a lot of older Native American women. And as the keepers of that knowledge within their family, many of them have never used a computer. And I used to, particularly one in particular, Yvonne Bear, my cousins that would come back and living in different parts of the world would come back and they would tell me, I saw this woman and she greeted me and told me that I'm your relative, and would explain the family tree. And I thought it was so amazing that she knew not only that these were the children of a relative, but, people grow up and, maybe the last time she saw them, they were a small child. So those are the things that continue the connections and building that fabric of kinship ties, and how important that is to know as far as your family tree or genealogy. And then beyond that, to try to understand the family story. So I wound up researching because as far as genealogy goes, I'm very fortunate to have an ancestor like Jane Robertson, who there is a wealth of documentation on, as well as oral history. The Robertson family as a whole is just a fascinating story. There are many, many aspects to it. And for her, we had studied in great detail her time within Minnesota, even her own ancestors, her grandmothers, and some of those relationships. So it's been something that has been, it's an ongoing project even for myself, because of course the family, I can't even tell you how many times I meet new relatives and they will inbox me and tell me that they're descendant of one of her children. And it's an incredible thing to know we have so many descendants. I would hope that she would be pleased that her ability and will to survive all of the things that she went through resulted in people like us.
That's so great. There's a really terrific picture in the book of Thomas Robertson on that trip to Washington, D.C. as a young man, and the rest of the group that went with him. It's just really, it's so striking. And also, she had a lot of kids. So there's probably a lot of different.
Just a side note on that comment, when he traveled as a boy, within his own biography, within his own writings, he talks about that trip and how he was 15 years old and he was on the train with these chiefs. And he said that he sat with them and they told war stories, they sang their death songs, and that must have been an incredible trip. And he said at one point they were coming up to a tunnel or a bridge, and one of the men, of course, never having been on a train before, saw it coming, jumped up and ran to the back of the train, and he was going to jump off because he was just sure that, they were going to die. But it was locked for just that reason, he said. So it was really amazing to find his own stories.
Thanks, Tamara. Jane, can you tell us your contact with Dakota, with Daybreak Woman?
Well, I kept coming across her name and her family's name in the course of my research that I had done some years ago now on Dakota and Euro-Dakota women and their relationships with Anglo-American men. And I studied the relationships and their families. And in the course of doing all that research, the Robertson name, Jane Anderson Robertson, kept coming up. And I came to learn more about them. And I realized I don't know how many years ago it was now, but I think, Cecilia, you were actually with me when this happened. I had an aha moment where I said, you know what? I think there might be enough on Daybreak Woman, on Jane Anderson Robertson, to write a full-length biography. And the reason why I thought I wanted to do this was I wanted to put a woman at a center. I wanted to put a Euro-Indigenous woman at a center of a story and use her story and her family's story to illuminate the broader history of the region. And so it turned out I was lucky in that, yes, I was able to find material, though of course a major challenge was that there's still, because she was a woman and she was a Euro-Dakota woman and she didn't leave her own account, there were lots of challenges, of course, with writing a full-length biography. But luckily, so many people, so the men in her family, especially her son Thomas, left this amazing memoir, but also I've been able to piece together things, other documentation with the help of Tamara, who helped me a lot with finding a lot of data. So, yes. So it's just a fascinating, she's fascinating, and her whole family is really, really interesting as well.
I'd like to come back to some questions about the process of gathering information in a minute. But before I do that, I'd like to just give Ashoka Dutta and Tamara an opportunity to say, what is it that you would like the readers of this book to know about Daybreak Woman? What information or feelings or stories about her would you like the readers to come away with? Tamara, will you start?
Sure, you bet. I think for me, it is that she is representative of many Native American women, and I think that there are things that we could learn from today. She certainly lived in two worlds, and I know many Native American people that probably feel that way. She, as well as her children, I think at one point in the U.S. Sisseton Wahpeton versus the U.S. in 1911, and the testimony related to that, when it came to her son Thomas A. Robertson, it said that during the period of the Dakota War, that there were many times where he could have been killed by either side. Mm-hmm. And to know that in some instances, and this would also be true of she herself, with Thomas A. Robertson as the son of Andrew Robertson, many times they described him as looking, by all intents and purposes, gives the appearance of a complete white man, and yet spoke perfect Dakota language. And so how those things all play into our world today. She, as somebody that lived through the most pivotal times in Dakota history, with a constant goal for the betterment of her people, whether it would be to, and I'm sure at times to be criticized for her work, maybe working with the agency or the government in the fashion that her husband did. I think one story always sticks with me about her, in that when she dies in 1911, when she dies, within her probate, it says that she had wanted to gift her land to a boy, a grandson by the name of Weatherstone. I believe his name is Robert Weatherstone. And he was just a young boy. And it left the sons having to explain to the probator, the court, why she would do this when she had so many relatives. Why would she leave everything to this one boy? And what Thomas said was that in her old age, she had become blind. And in her helplessness, the boy never left her side. So she was very grateful to him in wanting to leave her land. But because she was a Native American and at that time not a US citizen, her will was not recognized. So her land would have to be distributed, fractionated, just the same as everybody else's. And here is this woman who was educated in Canada, who assumed the role of Indian education after her husband died. She used her own attorneys to deal with her affairs while she lived in Redwood Falls. And even her own attorney, again, in the drafting of her will, to not have that recognized was something that was just so astounding to me. So it says a lot, I think, about our history as Native American people. And she is somebody, I think, that, in any examination of her life, would be somebody that honored her ancestors, her own people, and she would be a testament to those before her as well.
Thank you. There was also a question I wanted to direct right to you about, as a genealogist and an archivist, what benefit does knowing these stories, like the story of Daybreak Woman, have to this time, to this generation? And you began to answer that. I wonder if you'd want to say anything else about that.
Certainly. That being as somebody that works with, and now I have a dual role as a legislator, and we're looking at different laws that affect our people, or for example, our Native American voting rights. I think we live in a society that's so focused on American history that our Native stories, our history, are often untold. And for somebody that there is so much written about her, and you can follow all the way through to where I had an aunt tell me that in the examination of her her connections to the Robertson estate in Scotland, they found they had sent attorneys over, and it said within the writing that their return trip was ill-fated, and they had gone down on the Titanic. And it was just a unbelievable thing. And so when I ran to one of my aunts and I told her about that, and she said, yeah, I told you that like a year ago. And it was something that, it was a lesson that there were so many, there's so much oral history within my relatives. So it may not be something that I could find in a book. I think that that's really important, how these things work within our history, also related to the different legislation, as I had mentioned, about citizenship, voting rights, all of those things, Native American rights in general. And there are just so many aspects of the family story that I think, wind up being relevant today. It's something that I think I refer back to an awful lot.
That's so great. Thank you. That really also emphasizes one of the things that Jane talks about, in that this is a truly American story, that that link to the Titanic is kind of delightful in that it brings it together with a version of American history that we have. Thank you. Shisoka Dutta, could you comment on why Daybreak Woman is important to you and or your family and community?
Yeah, I can. Well, I think I agree with a lot of what Tamara says about why her story is so important. And, one of the things that sticks out to me is the importance of family, and how that's so important to our people. We call it Tiwahe family, or another way of saying Tioshpaye, which is community. And these things are very important to us, and also our connection to the land and to the place that we come from. We call it Minnesota Makoche. And we have this incredible connection here, and how when she was living in Canada. That was one of the things I found out about her, was that when she was going to get married, she said, but you have to take me back to my people in Minnesota Makoche, because she had that strong desire to get back there and to be part of reconnect with her relatives in the land. And I think about that a lot today with our people, and how we have this incredible connection here to this part of the world. And our language describes that connection, and our language describes our connection to our family. And a lot of these things you cannot translate to English. And so that's kind of what I think about. And also too, like, I think about it too in terms of our Dakota women, very important in the family, and how she was very active and taking charge of her affairs for the family. And a lot of times people, when they think about how our indigenous peoples, maybe they think, oh, you guys just got pushed over and assimilated and colonized, but we were actively fighting against those forces the whole way. And we did everything we could to fight back against the forces of colonization. And her story is a testament to that. And we are still doing that to this very day. And so I think she's a good example for all of our young Dakota women, and the young Wikoshka and Wichiana, that's our young women and our young girls, to look up to somebody like that. Because a lot of times when we think about Dakota history, one of the first things you think of is Ohiesa, Charles Eastman. And where's the stories about our Dakota women? They're there. And this is very good to help illuminate some of those stories for our people.
Thank you very much. Jane, I want to ask you, as a scholar and a historian, can you tell us a bit more about how this book took shape, how you honed in on Daybreak Woman as your topic, and maybe what was it about her life that resonated with your historical project?
Yes, well, as I said earlier, I've come across her name frequently in my other research. And one of the things that I found really interesting about her, and in one way in which she was really unique among the other women, the other Dakota women I researched who were in relationships with Anglo-American men, was that she had a very unusual situation, in that she spent the early years of her life with both her parents in Minnesota Makoche. And then she lived with her mother. Her father left, went to Canada. And so she was with her mother and her grandparents here. And then when she was about 12 or 13 years old, her father sent for her, and her mother, Gray Cloud Woman, agreed to send her and her brother up to Canada to be educated. And then she lived there with her father's second family for many years. And then at the point of her marriage, she decided, basically made it a condition of her marriage. She said to Andrew Robertson, I will marry you, but you have to take me back. So she wanted to go back to her mother and to her people back in Minnesota Makoche. But so that was really unusual. And I thought unusual because often the pattern was that with Anglo-American men who were involved with, who married Dakota women or were involved with them, often they divorced quite quickly, or they abandoned their wives and children. And so it was, she was an unusual subject in that she lived with both parents, and then one parent, then the other parent, for long periods of time. And so really, was rooted in both cultures. Mm-hmm. And so what I found fascinating is when she reaches that point where she's I think she was about 27 when Andrew proposed to her, but she she also had the choice. She also had a choice about how she wanted to live and where she wanted to live. And she recognized in Andrew too that he would do what she wanted, you know, and what she wanted was to go back and to reclaim, you know, to be with her mother, her grandmother, and her Dakota relatives in the Dakota community, go back to her homeland, which she identified as her own homeland, even though she, you know, she could have chosen to live as an Anglo-American woman, or to not go back. So that really, that choice really fascinated me, and just that her unusual, you know, family relationships and upbringing, and so, and just so that, you know, I just was so fascinated by her, and then her family connections, and then of course the more you get into it, the more interesting it becomes and more complex. So,
Go ahead, Tamara.
Yeah, great points. In fact, when in working with the older Robertson women here on the nation, when we were doing our own research, those were some of the things that, you know, when you think about this from a purely personal family story, you know, we wanted to know, they wanted to know, did he abandon them? Did he abandon them? And when we found his journals, Captain Anderson, when we found his journals and when he talked about, and I forget the sort of, I hate to say pet name, and that he called her, you know, his beloved something, that she had left him. She had left him. And so, you know, when we read that, you know, the women looked at each other and we talked about that, because that was the thought. Had she been abandoned? Did he abandon Gray Cloud Woman? And another important Dakota woman, Gray Cloud Woman, as well as her mother, Margaret Gray Cloud, they are also fixtures in American history that are often not noted. As Shishoka Dutta said, the working with the Lewis and Clark project, and knowing that Lewis and Clark had on their return trip met with her and her husband, Gray Cloud Woman and her husband, and it was the place where they had first read a newspaper in many, many months. So, and even the study of her ancestry, Gray Cloud Woman, and who winds up being the wife of Hazen Moores, and that she herself is the daughter of another Scotsman, Baird, or I may not say that correctly, but that he was a relative of a poet. I can't remember the name of the poet. It's been a while, but my aunt knows that. And that it was really interesting to see their common stories and of mixed ancestry, and how this whole world might have seemed to them when they lived here, and how we interacted together. Another interesting point along those lines that Jane had made with the older women, we found one of them had arrived at our family meeting, and she shared a document that she found, and it was the Anderson family researchers in Canada were also doing some genealogy, and within their discussion group, they had said, "Oh, look, our grandfather had a proverbial skeleton in the closet, in that he at one time was married to an Indian woman." And so, of course, the women, you know, they looked at that, and, you know, we thought about that. And of course, you know, there was a little bit, you know, taken aback by it, and then thought, just like with everybody else, well, we're going to reach out to them and we're going to meet them, and so that they can see, you know, who we are. And these ladies were really great in finding their relatives. But that was the perception. That was the perception on their side, and to know that we don't always understand each other's stories. There's, you know, nuances to all of it.
Thank you. In that idea of her living in the middle of all of these cultures, having been with her mother and her father, and choosing again and again to be in her community here with her mother and her extended family. Jane, as you were writing the story of her, how did you choose which of her names you would use?
Well, I was really struggling as I was doing the research and writing to keep her Dakota heritage and her as a woman as at the center of the story because of the nature of the sources and the fact that she didn't leave an account herself. And so I was struggling with that, how to keep her central to the story because, as I say in my introduction, sometimes she kind of gets lost because I'm having to tell the story like through the men in her family sometimes, what's going on with them. But it finally occurred to me at a certain point after I'd written a few chapters and I was using her English name and just feeling kind of like, can I keep her more central? And then it struck me, I started thinking about her mother and her grandmother, who were Gray Cloud women, known as Gray Cloud women. And, it occurred to me, and I thought, well, why isn't she known as Daybreak Woman if they're known as, and it occurred to me that a generational shift had occurred so that all the sources, almost all refer to her as Jane Anderson or Jane Anderson Robertson, and then they might give her Dakota name, and then they might give you the translation. And so I thought, it was at that point that I thought, it'd be important, I think, to make clear to the audience, to keep her Dakota heritage central. And so I thought, I want to title the book Daybreak Woman, which is the English translation of her Dakota name. And then I had made that decision. And then as I was continuing to write, I'm still struggling with keeping her central and keeping her Dakota heritage central. It struck me that by only using her English name, I felt like it was obscuring her Dakota heritage. And so I made the decision to use Daybreak Woman throughout the book to help, basically to kind of anchor her and her Dakota heritage throughout the book, and to keep that there.
Thank you.
Did that answer the question?
Yes. Shoshoko Duta, could you comment for a minute about, as a Dakota language teacher, what do you think it does for our communities in Minnesota to reclaim Indigenous names for places and people, as Minneapolis recently did for Bade-Makaska, and as Jane was saying she made the effort to do when she discussed it, Daybreak Woman?
Yes. Yep. I can talk about that. I think for our Dakota people, our connection to Minnesota Makoche has never been broken. And so we've always had that connection, and we've always maintained the place names, and we still use them to this very day. But I think for everyone else who is here, all the non-Dakota people, it's important that we start using the Dakota names for these places. And, if like Bade-Makaska, that instead of using the English Lake Calhoun, let's use the Dakota name that it's been called for countless generations. And we can do that with all kinds of places. A lot of them already have Dakota names. Minnesota, Shakopee, Chaske, Minnetonka. I mean, the list goes on and on. We could go on all evening with all the place names. But I think, for me as a Dakota person, when I learned that these places are origin in our language, that it makes me feel good. And I think a lot of our people are still learning. These are Dakota words, and these belong to our people, our language. And there's a story associated with each of the names too. And once you start to learn the story behind that place name, it makes you feel have a sense of pride and history that we've been here for a long time, and these stories are proof that we've been here in this landscape for a long time. And I think it's about time that the Minnesota, all the citizens start to learn this stuff too. Some of them do, and then Jane took my class at the University of Minnesota, and she learned this. But every semester I teach that class, a lot of the students say to me, "We had no idea that any of this happened. All these words are Dakota words," and I think we need to teach Minnesota history. We need to do a better job of teaching that to our people, all of Minnesota citizens. And but overall, I think it makes me feel really good.
Thank you. Jane, I'm going to toss that over to you because I know that when you talk about why this project was important to you, what Shoshoko-Duta just said was part of your aim for this book. Would you talk about that for a minute?
Yes, well, my aim in writing this book, my central aim was is to put Dakota and Euro-Dakota people back firmly in the center of the historiography of Minnesota, the literature of history of this region, the state and the region. And I think my contribution as a historian is to tell the real history. And as I define it, it's a multicultural history, whether you're talking about this region or the entire history of North America, right? And so that was a central aim of my book, to put Indigenous and Euro-Indigenous people back in the story, and also to put a woman at the center. So those were my two aims. And to, present a history that is complex, because history is complex. It's not simple. It's not all one thing or the other, and it's, but most importantly, our history is a multicultural history. And in what I call the dominant but obsolete narrative, there still seems to be a dominant narrative understood by the public, where Indigenous people are absent. They disappeared, or the only time they know anything about them is in connection to a war. In our state, it's the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. So yes, my aim is to make a contribution to what I would call multicultural and complex history, present a more accurate and comprehensive history of the past than we've. And this isn't something new. I mean, historians, both Dakota and non-Dakota historians, have been working for some decades now trying to do that. But one of my important aims in this book too was I didn't want to just write a scholarly book for historians to read. I wanted to write a book that would get out to the public, right? So that basically I'm trying to educate a wider audience, as Shoshoko-Duta had just suggested that we need to do, about what our past really looked like. And so yes, and I think telling a story, biography, telling a story of a person and a family and a community is a really effective way, I think, for people to learn the history too. I think people who otherwise might not want to pick up the book and read about it in era, they might find that too dry. But I think a biography, a story of this sort, can really pull people in. And I know for myself, the reason I ultimately became a historian or got interested in history was when I was in 5th grade. I found these biographies of historical figures written for children, and I just devoured them. And I never really looked back. From that time on, I knew that I loved history and I wanted to learn more. And so I think this genre, biography, is a really, really important tool. You kind of hook to get people, to pull people in, because you're telling a story. People want the stories, right? They get the emotional connection that way too, the empathetic connection. That's important. So.
Thanks. It's time for us to ask the audience for questions, and I have one here that I'd like to start off with because all three of you have touched on it at some point. It's from Sharon. As people try to build a multicultural history of Minnesota, how do you think about the role of oral histories along with books and other written works? Oh, there it is. Anyone want to start us off?
I'll just make a brief comment on that. I truly believe that often when you're working with this sort of history, the oral history for us is very prominent. And sometimes it may appear that they are opposition of each other with documented history or the existing history that's out there. But myself, I've always found that oral history is, I've never found it to be wrong. And to, it may need some shaping, it may need some understanding, but for us as Native people, it's always been my position to assert its value. I know that as an archivist and working with complex histories, it's you got to cite your sources, you got to show that documentation, and I've become very good at building that story and not relying strictly on oral history, because in academia often they would disregard that as non-factual. It's not something that within our own community, within our own circles that we do. That's how our history has been passed down for many years.
Sure, I could add something too. I agree with a lot of what Tamara says. And as a language teacher, I deal with oral history on a daily basis. And the oral histories of our fluent speakers who I have recorded many of them, and them telling their stories through their own words, and then transcribing and translating those into written form. And so, I think of just like written history as somebody wrote down the oral history at some point. And so why wouldn't oral history be just as valid? To me, I agree. Like, a lot of times academia kind of discounts our oral history. But the way we tell our oral history, we make sure that we tell it over and over again in multiple settings, and you have to tell it accurately, or somebody will see that you're changing the story, and then they'll call you out on it. And so our storytellers, they're master historians, and they're trained from a very young age to do this, to remember these stories and to pass them on, and not anybody can do it. It takes special people to do these things. And I've met a few of these people in the community, and you just sit down and they memorize you with these different stories, and they could talk for hours and you would be entertained the whole time. So I think oral history is very important, especially to Dakota people.
I muted myself, sorry. I was going to say, on your journey of putting this book together, you have used all sorts of sources, had to find your way through all kinds of letters and historical documents to put together this whole story. I'm wondering, aside from that, the multitude of snippets that you put together, did you encounter any particular challenges as a white woman historian telling this story?
Well, Yes, and I talk about this in the introduction. That, of course, as a historian, you know, history is as an endeavor, I think, is an arrogant one. We think that we can go back in time and retell the story and recreate events. And there are so many veils between the historian and that person or that event in the past, and that come between us potentially, whether it be race, culture, class, time, go down the list, gender. And so, as I point out in my introduction, what I'm trying to do in this book, or what I think I've done, is, bring my skills as a historian and someone with a lot of experience in women's history, and being transparent about who I am and what my standpoint is. But these are my skills. This is what I bring to it. I've looked at everything that I can look at. I've learned as much as I can learn as a non-Dakota person. Of course, there's always more to learn. I'm certainly not an expert by any means. And I've brought together as many Dakota sources as I could access and make available. And then so putting this all together, what I'm saying is, here is my interpretation, based on what I bring to this story. Here's this story, and I think it's an important contribution. I also think that this is work that we all have to do as historians, no matter who we are, right? So if we want to create this multicultural history that's been absent, it's work that we all have to do and contribute, and we have different contributions to make. So that's always a challenge. I think that what we have to do as historians is be explicit and transparent about who we are, what we bring, what are the questions we're asking, what are the challenges for us as historians, what are the veils, and what is obscuring us from understanding certain things. But then, having said all that and been explicit about it, then present your interpretation, present your story, and again, being very careful with the evidence. It also means that you look at sources, whether you're looking at it through a feminist lens or through veils of culture, and considering being a white historian looking at it, Dakota culture, Dakota history. It just means you have to be really conscious of that in terms of how you read the sources, how you analyze, what questions you ask, and then you do the best that you can do, right? So there are limitations, but then I think it's important to acknowledge what those are, and put together what you can, and make a contribution. But it's work, whether you're talking about multicultural history or social justice work that we have to do in our society today. It takes everyone. Everyone has to contribute, and you just have to be careful about what you claim, and who's and be explicit about it. But I think we all need to do the work. So,
thanks. We have a question from the audience, from one of the listeners. Were the Dakota matrilineal? Yeah, there it is, Margaret McHugh. Thank you. Where are the Dakota? Were they matrilineal?
Yes.
So the women are kind of at the center of the culture. Is that fair to say?
Well, I hate to answer this question as a man, but what everybody has told me, male and female elders and cultural spiritual leaders in my community, is that everything comes from the women. All our traditions, all our spiritual ways, our culture, they're the knowledge keepers. They keep the ceremonies, and they keep everything going. And everything's based upon that. And if you got married as a man, you would be expected to go live with your wife's community and become part of that community. So yes, the Dakota are matrilineal.
I'll add a comment to that too. I particularly like that Shishoka did his first statement and that answering it as a man, because our cultural ways are still a part of our everyday life as Dakota people. And yes, it isn't customary for a man to speak on things that maybe are related to women. Although he is an educator and he does have that right, I wanted to pause and let him do that because just to a little bit. But yeah, as far as Dakota women, our roles within our families are still, very strong as Dakota women. And I think that is true with Jane, and you could see her as the center of so much. I see that also with the Gray Cloud Woman and so on. So, and it's really the reason why I think the family exists so strong today.
We just have a few minutes left. I wanted to give, let's give Jane the last word here about what do we lose if we don't correct these obsolete narratives that are Minnesota history even now, if we don't expand and revisit this multicultural history that you're recreating in Daybreak Woman. What do we lose if we don't do that?
Well, we're denying the truth, I guess. That's how I would respond to that.
History.
I'm a historian, so I have to say this, but I really do believe it, that if you don't know history, you don't know anything, right? If you don't know the real history, how can we possibly understand the social justice issues of today or relationships today, social dynamics? You have to understand history, and I guess my answer to that is, what is lost? Well, what is lost is that you don't have an accurate portrayal of the past. You don't have a comprehensive multicultural portrayal of the past, and that was the reality, right? And so
thank you.
Yeah. Real quickly, my own work as a historian has been to present history in a factual manner and let those facts speak for themselves. And it really isn't, to me, a want that one version of history replace another. It's been my own goal to honor the history and the interactions of all the different relationships between our Dakota and the settlers, or even to acknowledge and honor the part of them as a mixed blood ancestor. The story of Andrew Robertson is incredible. The idea that he is possibly the lost Earl of Atholl, and all that goes along with some of those stories that have woven through the family for years, and whether we will ever find the answer. It says in one writing that who he truly was death shut his lips before he could tell his son. I've seen comments that said that he was a nobleman in disguise. So those certainly are, I think, aspects of anybody's ancestry and history that, warrant acknowledgement and certainly being honored. So it isn't ever my goal to rewrite history it's just to add to and develop a balance with presenting history. And so for us as tribal people, our goal is to take control of our cultural history by telling our own stories. and defining our own narrative for those generations to come. And along the line, I'd like to believe that by doing that, we can develop great relationships within the cities and communities around us by being able to understand each other better. And overall, I think that that is the big win in stories like this. The level of work that Jane has done into this is fantastic. And to find somebody that is a friend and an ally with a wish to honor Dakota people today and in the past is phenomenal. And to reach out to Dakota people to seek their side of the story or their voices in it is just phenomenal. And I really want to thank her for that. And it's something that shows in her work.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Tamara. Ned, would you mind putting Daybreak Woman's name in Dakota up here? Could you say that for us again, Shoshone-Duta?
Ampa o hiayewe.
So Jane Anderson, Daybreak Woman, one more time.
Ampa o hiayewe.
Thank you. This was so lovely as a celebration of this book and as a celebration of the woman at the center of it. And I want to thank all of you for joining this conversation, and thank Allison and Molly and Ned at the Minnesota Historical Society and the Center for Women at St. Kate's. Thank all of you for a lovely conversation and a pleasant evening. Good night.